Alright, let me tell you about this time I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It was a few years ago, and I was working as a temp at this huge corporate building. You know, one of those places where every floor looks the same, and if you aren't paying attention, you could get lost in a second. The job was pretty straightforward, mostly moving files, organizing storage rooms, that kind of stuff. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. So, one day my supervisor asked me to go down to the basement storage area to fetch some old records. Now, I'd never been down there before, and honestly, I wasn't looking forward to it. I mean, basements and buildings like that are always creepy, right? But it was part of the job, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the elevator. The elevator ride was weird. I pressed the button for the basement, and it felt like the elevator took way longer than usual to get there. You know that feeling when you start to think, is this thing stuck? It was like that, and when the doors finally opened, I was greeted with this long, dimly lit hallway. It didn't look like the kind of basement you'd expect in an office building. No storage lockers or file cabinets in sight, just this long corridor with flickering lights and that eerie hum of silence you only get in places that aren't meant for people. I stepped out, trying to convince myself it was fine. It's just a basement, right? I took a few steps, shining my flashlight around, looking for any sign of where these records might be stored. But all I could see were more hallways branching off in different directions. It was like a maze down there, with no signs or labels to tell you where to go. I started walking, hoping to find some kind of storage room or even just a desk or something. As I walked, I noticed that the floor was covered in this strange old carpet that didn't match the rest of the building's decor. It was this gross, faded green color with stains all over it, like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. I turned a corner, expecting to see some kind of storage area, but instead it was just another hallway, and then another. I must have walked for 10 minutes, taking turn after turn, and I was getting more and more lost. It didn't make any sense. The building wasn't that big. There was no way it had this many hallways, but every turn I took, it just led to more of the same. Then I noticed something else. There were no doors, not a single one. Just these endless corridors that twisted and turned in ways that didn't seem possible. And the more I walked, the more I started to feel like I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when you can just sense someone watching you? I couldn't shake it. I kept going though, thinking maybe if I just kept walking, I'd find my way back to the elevator. But the further I went, the weirder things got. The lights above me started flickering more intensely, casting these strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The air was getting thicker too, like it was hard to breathe, and that strange hum was growing louder. I turned another corner, and that's when I saw it. At the end of this hallway was a door. Finally, a door. But it wasn't a normal door. It was this heavy metal thing with no handle, just a small, frosted window at eye level. I walked up to it, trying to peer through the glass, but I couldn't see anything on the other side. It was just darkness. I knocked on the door, hoping someone might hear me, but the sound just echoed down the hallway. No response. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. It felt like I was in some kind of nightmare, but I was wide awake. I turned around to go back the way I came, but as soon as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway I had just walked through wasn't there anymore. It was a completely different corridor, stretching out in front of me with more of those flickering lights and dirty, stained carpet. Panic started to set in. I was completely lost. Every direction looked the same, and there was no way to tell where I was or how to get out. I pulled out my phone, but, of course, there was no signal. I tried to use the flashlight on it to see if I could find some kind of clue, but it barely cut through the darkness. I don't know how long I wandered around down there. It felt like hours. I started calling out, hoping maybe someone would hear me, but my voice just echoed back at me. It was like the walls were absorbing the sound, swallowing it up so that no one else could hear it. Then I started hearing things. At first it was just faint, like a whispering sound coming from somewhere down the hall. I thought maybe it was the hum of the lights or the building settling, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't that. It sounded like whispers, but not in a language I could understand. Just this soft, indecipherable murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I kept moving, trying to find my way back to the elevator, but every turn I took just led to more hallways. I was completely disoriented. There was no rhyme or reason to the layout. It was like the place was designed to confuse and trap you. Then I saw something that nearly made me lose it. Up ahead, the hallway split into two paths, and standing there, right at the fork, was a figure. It was just standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow or something. But the longer I stared, the more I was sure it wasn't a shadow. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. I shined my flashlight on it, but the beam just seemed to bend around it, like it was avoiding being seen. I took a step back, my mind racing with what to do. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. I turned and bolted down the opposite hallway, not caring where it led, just needing to get away from whatever that thing was. My footsteps echoed loudly as I ran, the whispers getting louder and more frantic. The hallways seemed to twist and warp around me, like they were changing with every step I took. Finally, I saw another door up ahead. This one was different though. It looked like a normal door, a plain wooden door with a simple brass handle. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to get out of those hallways. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open, stumbling through it. I found myself back in the office building, right where I had started. I was in the hallway outside the elevator, the same one I'd walked down to get to the basement. I turned around, expecting to see the door I had just come through, but it wasn't there. It was just a plain wall. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. It was like nothing had happened. The hallway was exactly as it had been when I first got off the elevator. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something coming after me, but it was just me, alone in the hallway. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I went straight to my supervisor's office and told him I couldn't find the records. He gave me a strange look but didn't press the issue. I think he could tell I was shaken up, though he probably thought it was something else. I didn't go back to the basement after that. I avoided that elevator, that hallway, and that entire floor. I didn't even ask anyone else if they'd ever been down there or seen what I saw. I was too freaked out, too scared that they might confirm it, that it wasn't just my imagination. I ended up quitting that job not long after. I told them it was for personal reasons, that I needed to move on. But the truth is, I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. That somewhere in the back rooms of that building, there was something waiting, watching, and I had just barely escaped it. Now whenever I walk into a building I'm not familiar with, I can't help but look for doors that seem out of place, hallways that don't make sense. I tell myself it was just a one-time thing, just a fluke or a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know that those back rooms are out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into them. And if they do, I hope they're smarter than I was before it's too late. Alright, let me tell you about this one time that still messes with my head. It's probably the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me, and I've been through some weird stuff. I used to work in this big corporate office building downtown, and my job was pretty mundane. Just the usual desk work, a bit of filing, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was this one day that went way off script, so it was a typical Wednesday, and my boss asked me to head down to the basement to retrieve some old records. Now, I had been working there for a few months, but I had never actually been to the basement before. I'd heard other people mention it, but no one ever really said anything about what was down there. Honestly, I thought it was just a storage area, no big deal. I took the elevator down, expecting to find a standard basement with file cabinets and maybe some dusty old boxes. But when the elevator doors opened, I was immediately hit with this uneasy feeling. The hallway in front of me was dimly lit, with this weird yellowish light that made everything look sickly. And the air, it was heavy, musty, like it hadn't been circulated in ages. I stepped out of the elevator, thinking I'd just grab the files and get out as quickly as possible. The hallway stretched out in front of me, with several doors lining each side. All of them were closed, and there was no signage or labels to indicate where anything was. I picked a door at random, hoping it would lead to the storage room. When I opened it, I was met with a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were this off-white color, almost beige, and they looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. There was this faint buzzing sound coming from somewhere, probably the old fluorescent lights flickering above. I walked down the corridor, expecting it to end or branch off into some kind of room, but it just kept going. I remember thinking to myself, this doesn't make any sense. The building wasn't that big, and yet this hallway felt like it was going on for miles. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. Typical, right? I decided to turn around and go back the way I came, but when I turned, the corridor behind me looked different. It wasn't the same corridor I had just walked through. It was like it had changed, shifted somehow. I tried not to panic. I mean, it was just a hallway, right? But the more I walked, the more it felt like I was going in circles. Every turn I took led me to another identical looking corridor. No doors, no windows, just this endless maze of beige walls and that annoying buzzing sound. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I started marking the walls with a pen I had in my pocket, just to see if I was actually going in circles. But every time I thought I was back at a spot I had marked, the marks were gone. It didn't make any sense. I know it sounds crazy, but it was like the walls were erasing the marks or something. I can't explain it. After what felt like hours, I came across a door. It was the first one I had seen since I started walking through this maze. It was this plain wooden door with a brass handle, totally out of place in the sterile beige corridors. I hesitated for a moment, but then I figured it was my only way out. I opened it, and behind it was another corridor, but this one was different. The walls were lined with shelves, like a library or something, filled with old files and boxes. I thought maybe I had finally found the storage area, but then I noticed that the shelves weren't in any kind of order. It was like someone had just shoved things onto the shelves at random. There were boxes labeled with dates from decades ago, mixed in with ones that looked brand new. I started going through the boxes, looking for the records my boss had asked for, but I couldn't find anything. None of the labels made sense. They were just random words and numbers that didn't mean anything to me. And then, as I was digging through one of the boxes, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a soft whisper coming from somewhere in the room. I stopped what I was doing and listened. It was definitely a voice, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, or maybe from the shelves themselves. I called out, thinking maybe someone else was down there, but there was no response, just that whispering sound. I started to get really freaked out at this point. I mean, this was just supposed to be a quick trip to the basement to grab some files. And now I was in this weird maze-like back room with whispering walls. I decided I needed to get out of there, and fast. I turned to leave, but of course the door I'd come through was gone. In its place was just another set of shelves, filled with more boxes and files. It was like the room was changing around me, messing with me. I started to panic, pulling boxes off the shelves, trying to find some other way out, but there was nothing. Just more shelves, more boxes, and that whispering sound getting louder and louder. I don't know how long I was in there. It felt like hours, maybe even days. I was losing track of time, losing my sense of reality. The whispering was getting more intense, like it was surrounding me, filling my head with this constant murmur of noise. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything other than finding a way out. I started running, just sprinting down the aisles between the shelves, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from the whispers. But no matter how far I ran, the room seemed to stretch on forever. There was no end, no exit, just this endless labyrinth of shelves and boxes, and that maddening whispering. Finally, I collapsed on the floor, exhausted, defeated. I thought this was it. I was going to be stuck in this place forever. But then, just when I was about to give up, I saw it. A door, at the far end of the aisle I was in. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. But now, there it was. Just a plain wooden door, like the one I had come through. I didn't think, I just ran for it. I grabbed the handle, threw it open, and stumbled through. I expected to find another corridor, another set of shelves, but instead I was back in the basement hallway where I had started. I turned around to look at the door I had just come through, but it was gone. There was nothing there, just a blank wall. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was like the whole thing was some kind of bizarre dream, but I knew it wasn't. It was too real, too vivid to be just a dream. I went straight back to my office and told my boss I couldn't find the records. He just gave me this weird look and said he'd send someone else to get them. I wanted to tell him what had happened, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. I never went back to that basement again. I avoided it like the plague. Whenever someone mentioned it, I'd feel this chill run down my spine and I'd have to leave the room. I don't know what that place was or why it was there, but I know I never want to see it again. Now, whenever I go into a building, I always make sure to avoid any doors or hallways that seem out of place. I don't want to end up in those back rooms again because I'm not sure if I'd make it out a second time. Whatever that place was, it felt like it was watching me, waiting for the next person to stumble in and get lost in its endless maze.